Hello, today we're going to be going over the basic idea of crystallization, specifically within the 2AR, but we will address the 2NR in Lincoln Douglas debate rounds. Just as like a quick overview of what crystallization is, it's the idea of trying to crystallize and make clear at the end of the round what has gone on in the round and make it clear for your judge why you should win. And you probably have not heard the term crystallization before. More commonly, you've simply heard the term voter issues, and voter issues are a big part of crystallizing. They're the vast majority of what it comes down to. But crystallization encompasses the bigger idea of deciding what the voters are going to be, giving them, also doing things like clarifying the framework and who's winning there. And it's all these big ideas of things that we should clear up for our judge right before we finish up the round. So there's really not too much else we need to give to set the context, I believe. So let's get right into how we are going to actually crystallize the round. We have our process here, and we're just going to go down this document and make notes of all of it. So obviously, as we see, the first thing that you need to do, obviously, is select the arguments that you want to use before you actually get into your speech. Obviously, we have some things that are going to take precedence over others. The very first thing that you need to do on pretty much any round, no matter what side you're debating, is clarify the framework, because that is going to change the lens by which we view the rest of the voter. So, for instance, obviously you're going to want to be arguing that your framework is winning, which should help you out, because then let's say you're on the affirmative and your value is that of societal justice and your value criterion is that of resisting oppression. Now that we know our focus is on resisting oppression, that is going to change what voters we choose going into the voters, because obviously we're going to be focusing on impacts that reduce oppression. However, if obviously you wouldn't argue that your opponent is going to win the framework, but let's say your judge thinks that the opponent is and you don't touch on framework, then now let's say we're viewing it through a more general utilitarian lens, that can harm your voters, because you might be focusing on resisting oppression, but if your opponent goes for other higher magnitude impacts such as extinction, then obviously you're going to lose even if you win your voters, because extinction is wins on utilitarian frameworks. So you need to make sure first and foremost that you are clarifying the framework, because otherwise the rest of this isn't going to really matter at all. From that point forward, we actually need to decide what voters we are going to talk about. So you want to be focusing on things that are offense. Now, we've talked about this a little bit in previous videos, so I won't touch on it too much, but offense are arguments that are actually going to win you the round. I like to compare it to a basketball game. You have offense and defense. Offense is what scores you points, and defense is what prevents your opponent from scoring points. And obviously, defense is critical, because if your opponent is scoring a bunch of points, you're going to lose the game. But you do need to have offense as well. Even if you have the best defense ever, if you're not scoring any points yourself, it's impossible for you to win that game. So you need to have some offense to help you win the game. Similarly, in debates, you need to have some offense to help you win the round. You can go through and say why you shouldn't vote for your opponent's side all day, but if you don't give me reasons to vote for your side, then I'm just going to think it's a wash. If you're essentially saying everything my opponent says isn't true, but you don't provide any ideas of your own, then I'm still going to vote for your opponent, because even on the very, very, very low chance that their things do happen, it's still better than on if everything you say is true, because you haven't given me anything that I should be looking forward to if I vote for your side. So essentially, you want to be focusing on actual reasons why doing what you're saying, affirming or negating the resolution, is going to be better for society. Those are going to be the things you want to focus on. Obviously, you're going to want to focus on arguments that you're winning, and you're going to want to weigh it against arguments that you're losing. You obviously don't want to say that you're losing these arguments. If you do more Nat Circuit LD, then it's okay to just be I'm losing arguments. I'm not going to focus on them anymore. But in traditional LD, that's obviously not acceptable. So that point's a little less important. You should be trying to weigh against arguments you're losing, but don't put it that way. Just make it sound like you're winning everything, but this is what is most important because it's the ones you're actually winning. Generally, what's going to be best for voter issues are arguments with, as it says here, a lot of ink on the flow, because that means that people have been talking about this throughout the round. If you have an argument that you guys have just kind of like thrown one like response back and forth and like no real progress has been made, then you're not doing anything to actually help yourself, right? Like nothing's really been said, there's nothing to clarify. What's the point of bringing it up? However, if you choose an argument where there's been a bunch of responses to it, a contention where each time a person has put like 3 responses to the argument, then obviously there's going to be a lot to talk about. You're going to want to clarify to your judge why you're winning, and then you can access the impacts of that argument, such as like reducing oppression or whatever example we want to use. So those are generally going to be the best, especially because if you have arguments with not a lot of flow on them, they're probably unimportant to the round because you would have put more flow on them earlier. Like you're not going to leave off super important arguments in your 1AR because then you're just setting yourself up for failure. You're going to spend your time focusing on the important arguments, and we should do the same here. And then obviously the whole point of crystallization is to focus on the most important arguments in the debate. So you can't go for every single argument. That was a mistake that I would always make my freshman year. I luckily figured it out pretty quickly that you can't do this. But in the 2AR, I would go down the affirmative flow, the negative flow, and still try and do key voter issues in a 3-minute speech, which meant that like my 2ARs were all garbage because you simply don't have enough time to do all that. Instead, you need to make sure you go only for the important arguments, which is obviously what we're seeking to do here. So once you have those general arguments, we need to turn them into voter issues. So it's important to remember that arguments are just like contentions, right? Or maybe subpoints if you have those in your contention. They're these like general arguments, but we need to have bigger ideas for our voter issues. Your voter issue shouldn't be something hyper specific that comes with your subpoint. It should be a big idea like equality. Now, generally, these things are going to somewhat align with your contentions. Obviously, if your first contention is super focused on like income inequality and your second one isn't, and you're going for equality, that first contention is going to be pretty much all that you talk about. But you want to make sure that you word your voters as like these bigger ideas. Your first voter issue should not be your first contention. It should, at the very worst, be what your first contention is talking about. So you would say, my first voter issue is equality instead of, your first contention. Beyond that, we want to make sure that we're not trying to choose entire contentions as voters if we can. We want these like bigger themes, but like I said, that's like not quite as applicable with what we're dealing with here. We have this little point here about trying to categorize different cards into different themes. That's somewhat important, but to be quite honest, I think that you're just going to make yourself a bit more confused by doing that. I think you should just be trying to focus on, this is what idea I'm going for. Where can I achieve it? And most of it is going to come down to just some small cards under your contentions. And then, of course, at the end, you're going to want to link this back to your framework. We built up the framework for a reason, so it only makes sense that we want to once again explain to our judge how the fact that you're winning on this voter issue means that you're winning the framework as well, or you're achieving the framework, and thus you should win the round. Because remember, in LD, that is the end goal, is to achieve the framework. So you want to make it clear to your judge that that's exactly what you're doing. Now, beyond that, there are some basic parts of voters, and this is pretty simple to remember. You want to number them first and foremost. That's a basic idea, obviously, that we have in most LD concepts to just make it easier to follow. So my first key voter issue, easy enough. And you want to label it with a like small term as to what you're talking about. So I've been using equality as an example. So my number, key voter issue is equality. That's simply one word. It could be like a bit more, but you generally, once again, since we're keeping it as these big concepts, don't want to get it too complicated for your judge. You just want to right off the bat say, here's the idea that I'm talking about. And then, of course, you're going to go through and say why you are winning on that key voter issue. So specifically, what I like to do is like point out the points of contention that me and my opponent had been making, and then say why they're wrong or why I'm right. So I'll bring up like big pieces of evidence that I read that weren't really like addressed super well, or their arguments that they've made and why like I can turn that, or why it's just simply untrue or whatever. and go through and be like, thus, clearly, I'm the only side that can actually be helping equality or, whatever we need. And then, as we've already said, you got to bring it back to the framework. You can't just have these big ideas floating out there. We need to actually give them a purpose in the round, which is, of course, to achieve the value criterion. So here's a quick example of a second affirmative rebuttal voter. It's on this topic. States ought to eliminate their nuclear arsenals from last year, and with the value criterion of protecting right to life. So just going through, we can clearly see like how we hit all these parts. So my first, there's our number. Voting issue is harms to innocent civilians. That's our label. Notice this one is a bit longer because it's a bit more specific of a concept than just like equality. I win this in 2 places. That's a nice way to just like, if you're going to give multiple places you win, it's nice to kind of like mark them to make it easier for the judge. And then we actually go through. I'm not going to read this whole thing. You can, obviously. But we explain that we are going to be helping to protect innocent civilians by these 2 different places within the round. And we can see that we are linking it back to the value criterion, harms to innocence, linked to the value criterion. So we are connecting it back to the standard. And then we do it again with the second like reasoning. You only need 1, but if you have more, obviously that's always the best. And then a couple more notes on just having this. Obviously, you're going to want to order your voters, as we already said, making it clear that you're on your first, your second, your third, however many you can get to, and you should always lead to your strongest. This is because you only have so much time in the round, and it's always better to over-prepare than under-prepare, obviously, but you do have to be, like, ready for the idea that you might not get to, let's say, all 3 voter issues that you planned out. Now, I like to be a bit stylistic with some things. I think if you have a really big voter issue and like you want it to stay with your judge, that you might keep it till the end. So, for instance, I had a round where my opponent was using this author that was claiming that this issue was going to happen if we affirmed the resolution, but was instead actually arguing that this issue would happen, but it's the reason for us to reject the system because it was unjust and therefore like it would make it fall. That's a bit like a complicated explanation without getting more into it. But the general idea behind it was that they made it sound like they were arguing for one thing, but they were actually using that reasoning to argue for my side. So I waited until the very end, and that was where I brought that up, where I was like, my opponent is literally using an author that supports what I'm saying because of all the issues I brought up. That was a really like persuasive point, at least in my mind. It was on the judges' ballot, so it was for them too. So saving it until the end, make sure I could implant it in their judge minds, into their heads, and that they'd remember it whenever they are writing on the ballot. So there's sometimes when you can like break the rule where you do the most important one first, but generally you're going to want to lead with that just in case you run out of time and then you don't get to your biggest idea. But obviously if you do want to try and like put something off until the very end, just make sure you're keeping an eye on the clock and being smart with your speech order as time goes on. I generally wouldn't try and like push stuff off unless you're like able to think on your feet in the speech and like kind of decide when you're going to go from one idea to the other, which is something that obviously comes with a bit of time if you don't have it right off the bat. But you definitely will acquire that skill with doing more rounds. So anyway, that's just a little spiel on that. Otherwise, you want to be careful with your time limit. Most people would say that your like individual voters shouldn't exceed 1 minute. Personally, I disagree because I'd rather go with one big idea that I can like really hammer home to my judge if I need to, than like a bunch of them. So generally, like in the 2AR, I will not read more than 2 voter issues. Like I really am going to have to be pushing it if I am, because they're definitely going over 1 minute. So there's a little bit of disagreement there, but that is like the general rule in the LD community. Like, I don't want to say like that, but that's generally what most people would say. I just personally don't think it's super important, but I'll throw that out there in case I'm wrong. Otherwise, we do have a couple things to note here. Just a like fun little example and like training exercise and deciding what is most important. So you can like pause the video for a minute here and label these 5 different arguments from 1 to 5, 1 being the most important and 5 being the least important for your key voter issues in your 2AR. So Alrighty, now that you have paused and gotten that done, let's go through and say which ones are the most important. So, as we discussed, the very first thing you're going to want to do in the round is to clarify the standards debate and decide whose framework is actually going to be winning and how we're going to be weighing the rest of the round. So, that is going to be the very first thing that we do. So now we need to decide what we're going to do next. And as we already talked about, offense is going to be the most important thing for the round. So we need to be focusing on where we can actually have offense and reasons to vote for our side and not just reasons not to vote for our opponents. And it also needs to be saying that we very clearly are winning, which is going to lead us from a card from our case with important offense that you extended in the 2AR. So our opponent might have addressed this a little bit, but they didn't probably do it super well, and we were still able to extend that evidence, which means that's standing pretty strong in the debate. It gives us really good offense as for why we should vote for our side. So it's going to be the next thing we're going to want to talk about. Beyond that, we need to be focusing next on places where we can help turn and keep our better ideas. So we dropped this really important argument in the 1AR, which is going to definitely harm us. We need to bring it up because not only is that a reason to vote for their case, but we lost offense since it was a turn on our case. So the hope would be to turn that back, get that important argument in, and not only stop them from having that, but win that argument again on our side. Probably not super likely, but we can still hope for it. So now we are down to these two big issues, which is a turn placed on the NC that was answered, but not very well, and then the negative voting issues in the NR. And we are definitely going to focus on the turn in the NC. This one and number 3, personally, could have a little bit of give and you swap them. That's definitely understandable. But this one would definitely go next if the other one is 3, because that turn, once again, can give us a bit of offense. It's not the best thing ever because we'd prefer to be focusing on our own case, but it's still definitely something, and it's not. We should not turn our noses away from it. And then lastly, the negative voter issues in the NR. That's definitely not a focus we're going to be having with our voter issues because they're really not bringing up new ideas in the voter issues. They're just kind of making their own clarification of the big ideas, and we're not going to directly contest that and say that they're wrong. We're just going to go through our own voter issues. So that is definitely the least important. So now just a quick couple notes for the negative rebuttal specifically. All the other stuff has just been kind of general voting issue stuff. You are going to want to crystallize in the negative rebuttal. A lot of people sometimes just want to spend the entire rebuttal on the flow and addressing the 1AR, but that's definitely not good. And you're going to have extra time to actually get voter issues, and you definitely should. Obviously, though, you should have already established the framework at the beginning of the round, so you don't need to hit that again. So you can just go straight into voter issues whenever you're ready to crystallize. Yeah, and so we see that was actually the next point. You don't want to go into your voters too terribly early. Now, I understand if as novice you guys kind of get through the line by line super quickly and have to go through voters, especially because your opponents aren't overly good. And there's not going to be a whole lot of arguments to address. And if you've addressed everything on the flow and you still have 3 minutes left, well, there's only so much you can do. I even have some rounds like that where after addressing everything, I simply have too much time because they didn't put a lot of arguments down. But also you guys are obviously probably going to be speaking quickly because you're nervous and you're going to be, sometimes your responses are going to be very short. So understandably, you might be done with everything on the line by line and ready for voters with more than 2 minutes. So this isn't a hard and fast rule, obviously, but it definitely should be what you aim for. Because I don't know about you guys, but to me, the 1AR is the hardest speech, although it is probably my favorite, honestly, because you have so much to address in such a short amount of time. And then we have that same amount of things to address in the 2NR, only we have an extra 2 minutes to give it. So definitely whenever I give the speech, I am extending into way past the 4-minute mark and usually give myself about 1 minute to do voters. But, it can be a little bit longer than that. As with the affirmative ones as well, you don't want to like lose sight of your big ideas, because if you have way too many voters, then it's going to become convoluted. And remember, the whole point of the key voter issues is to like make the ground very clear for your judge. If you're not doing that, what's the point of giving voter issues at all? So you should try and keep them limited. And just like explain to your judge why negating the resolution is actually going to make the world a better place. And then, of course, as always, weigh the round, say why your voters are the most important. Enough said about that. Now, lastly, moving on to our considerations for the 2AR, a lot of it's going to be somewhat similar. Obviously, the whole goal is to crystallize and narrow down like the round for your judge. Let them know once again what happens when you vote for the affirmative side. You also do sometimes want to look for issues that your opponent and you have in common. So, for instance, on this last topic about the federal jobs guarantee, a lot of them had to do with the economy. So, if I could just like get really good voters about the economy, then I can address their points and my points at the same time in one voter issue and do like double damage. As with the stuff we talked about earlier, you do want to address like specific cards. I don't think we need to go too much more in that. That's just reasoning on why you're actually winning when you give the voter. Once again, link it back to your framework. That's also something you're going to want to do on the negative uh, voter issues as well, because if we're not achieving our value and value criterion, what's the point of doing this? You can also do it to both yours and your opponent's value criterion. Obviously, you're going to want to be saying that your value criterion is the one taking precedence, but like if you can achieve both of them, why not? Then you can even win under your opponent's framework. And as always, present the limited number of frameworks. Don't get too much into it, because otherwise you're going to like convolute the round, which is not what we're trying to do. Right. So, lastly, we have a couple of things to remember whenever we're giving our 2AR. Most of the stuff we've already said. So, you can have a little drill right here if you want to help get yourself ready for actually practicing this end round. So, you're going to take a flow from an earlier round, assuming you guys have had that yet. Some of you might be watching this video before you've ever gone into a real round, and then create a voter issue. And you got to make sure it has these things that we talked about earlier. So, a number saying what your voter issue is, a label, which is what it's about. You actually explain where you won the argument, which is kind of like both of these in general, a connection back to the value criterion, and then a weighing mechanism to refute a negative voting issue. If you get all these in there, then you got everything you need for a really good voter issue, and you should be good to start getting into crystallization in your own rounds. But otherwise, there's not too much beyond that. I hope that drill is helpful, and as always, I hope this whole video was helpful and educational. And